podcasts.
The Profile. You're listening to Premier Christian Radio.
Well, hello and welcome to The Profile here on Premier Christian Radio with me, Sam Hales. This show is brought to you in association with the magazine that I edit, Premier Christianity Magazine. If you'd like a free sample copy, just go to our website, premierchristianity.com. Today on the show, I've got a really special guest who I'm talking to all the way from Vancouver in Canada. It's Joshua Harris, who is best known for his book, I Kissed Dating Goodbye. It was a controversial book at the time and since, and Joshua has been on a fascinating journey of really delving back into the book he wrote and even talking to some of his critics. It's all detailed in a brand new documentary called I Survived, I Kissed Dating Goodbye, which is available now. And Joshua joins me on the line. Joshua, thanks so much for being on the show.
Oh, it's great to be with you, Sam.
So here on the show, Joshua, we always like to go right back to the beginning of someone's life. So tell me a bit about childhood, growing up. Was it a Christian family?
Yes, I grew up in a Christian home. My parents had come to faith in the United States during what was called the Jesus movement. They were hippies who learned about Jesus and completely changed their life. And so I was taught from a very young age about what Jesus had done for me and really gave my life to him as a young child.
So tell me, what led up to you writing this book that's become so famous, perhaps even infamous in certain circles? Because it was a very early age, wasn't it? You're only early 20s when you wrote this book about dating. So tell me, what was the kind of progression to that point?
Well, I essentially had been in the dating scene, if you will, had different girlfriends in high school and gone against the advice of my parents when it came to this topic. And I reached a point in my life where, in a sense, the area of relationships was the one area that I wasn't willing to really consider in light of my Christian faith. And so when I ended a relationship in high school with a girl that I'd been going out with for several years, I felt a real sense of conviction that I had mistreated her, that I had used her, that I had broken a lot of promises. And so I was very disillusioned with how that had worked and began to read the books that my parents had been trying to force me to read, Elizabeth Elliot's Passion and Purity and others, and began to write about and interact with other people my age about this topic. And that led to me speaking and talking about the problems with dating. And at the time in the world that I was in, the idea of courtship, this idea of more purposeful relationships was quite popular. And I began to, in a sense, put that in my own words. And eventually that led to the concept for I Kissed Dating Goodbye.
So I Kissed Dating Goodbye wasn't the first Christian book to kind of put forward this idea of courtship?
No, I think there were quite a few other books, but they were more in the subculture in the States of homeschooling, which was a large movement. My dad was a very well-known leader and speaker in that movement. And so there was a lot of discussion, and basically my book popularized those ideas and took them to a much broader audience of evangelicals.
Yes, and we'll move on to obviously talk more in detail about how your views, I guess, on your own book have changed over time. But just before we get there, for those who aren't familiar with the whole idea of courtship versus dating, you were really proposing that that dating had some negative ideas attached to it, I suppose, and you were putting forward courtship as an alternative. So what are the differences, in your mind back then at least, between those two ideas, and why would courtship be a better model for you at that point than dating?
Well, it's interesting. I actually didn't use the word courtship in my book, I Kissed Dating Goodbye. I didn't necessarily like that term and felt that it sounded kind of archaic. But the basic principle of it is that dating relationships are short term. They're just about having a good time in the moment. They're not serious. They're not headed towards commitment. They're isolated from community. And so courtship became this sort of catch-all phrase that meant different things to different people. So that's what's kind of confusing about it. But essentially, the idea behind it was you're pursuing commitment, you're being intentional, you're not playing games with the other person. Um, you are trying to care for them. You're waiting to get into the relationship until you have the ability to actually consider and pursue commitment. And then you're doing that in the midst of community, the community of your church, the involvement of your parents who actually know you. So I was in a setting that, you know, in a sense, there was a range of how people applied and thought about those things. There were some extremely conservative expressions of this where, in a sense, parents were making decisions for their kids and that type of thing. But I was trying to, share those ideas in a way that was more palatable and that I felt that I could, get behind. But, in a sense, I was like the liberal version of courtship in the homeschool world, but obviously in the broader world,
Yes.
very radical and really kind of wild ideas for people.
Sure. So did you begin speaking on this before someone approached you with a proposal for a book? How does that whole thing of someone in their 20s, very early in their 20s, kind of being offered a book deal,
Right.
where did that come from?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I was publishing a small magazine for homeschool teenagers called New Attitude and editing that. So I was doing a lot of writing. That was giving me a platform and an audience um, that was unique for a person my age. And this was before, everybody had a blog or a YouTube channel.
Yeah.
Um, and I was also traveling around doing conferences, we'd have several thousand kids and parents come and listen to me speak on a number of topics, including the topic of dating. And so I also had the advantage of my dad having been in the publishing world. He had his own publishing company, and I would go to different events and meet, people in the industry. And so those connections really gave me the opportunity to understand how to write a book proposal and get that to different publishers. And it was turned down by a few, but then it was accepted, and I got an offer from a few publishers and ended up going with one. So I was just so excited. I mean, it was a dream of mine to write something, and the fact that I could get something published was, incredibly exciting to me as a young person.
Yes. Now, just to fast forward for a minute slightly, since you've reevaluated your book, some people have said, oh, well, should the publishers almost bear some responsibility for letting someone so young, and you weren't married at the time of writing the book, someone who perhaps wasn't an expert, whatever that means, on this subject. Looking back, do you have any sympathy with that argument? Do you think that the kind of gatekeepers of the publishing world should have said, well, maybe Joshua, come back to us in 5 or 10 years' time where you know a bit more about the subject?
I actually don't feel a sense of pointing fingers and blaming other people in that way. There are many books that are written with much more, I would say, radical, concepts and ideas by people of all ages. So I'm very hesitant to start trying to control or, in a sense, create these rules of how old someone has to be or how, young they are when they're prohibited from sharing ideas and those types of things. But I think that it's wise for, anyone who's involved in wide scale influence, whether they're in the media or whether they're in the publishing world, to be, circumspect and to ask the question, okay, do we feel good about giving this person a platform? At the end of the day, the issue of age is not necessarily I think the thing that is most easily going to reveal what the consequence of ideas is. It's you let an idea out into the world, and it's hard to measure what the results will be. And I think even what is complex about my book is that there are thousands of people who would say it had a very positive effect. So that was the challenge for me, even in this process, is to try to understand and measure, which ultimately you can't do. I had to come to my own conclusions based on my own thinking about how to view the book. But it's not an easy thing to measure the positive or negative influence of writing.
Just in the immediate, I guess, few months and years when the book was published, Do you remember what the reaction was?
Yeah, well, I think the initial reaction was very positive. There was a lot of excitement. It was, um, all the people who had been attending my conferences and reading my magazine, they were the initial, they'd been following me in my writing process. They were excited to see this happen. It was sort of, in a sense, we were a team, and these were ideas we'd been talking about, and suddenly that was being shared into the broader world, and so they were grabbing it and reading it and sharing it with other people. So there was a tremendous amount of enthusiasm, and I think there were a lot of people who were saying, "This is what we've already been saying for a long time, and you're giving voice to this." So there were a lot of people who had been having the same questions and critique of um, modern dating, and finally someone was kind of calling those things out and critiquing that, so they were excited.
And one of the central messages in the book, I think it's at the beginning of the book, and you also use this in the documentary you've just made, is of a man and wife on their wedding day standing at the front of a church. Do you want to explain that metaphor and really how that came about? Because I think that is quite a fundamental point that kind of carries through the rest of the book, doesn't it?
It is. When you're a writer, you're trying to share different ideas, and I'm working with my editors, and they would come back to me and say, "Okay, you need an illustration here to kick things off, to grab people's attention." And I remember working on that first chapter, trying to communicate my own journey of why I was questioning dating and why I had regrets about it, and why people should, even consider this concept of not dating. And a young woman wrote me a letter in response to an article that I had written, and she shared in that letter a dream that she had in which she was at her wedding at the altar, and the groom was standing there, and suddenly all these other women began to approach and stand next to him and hold his hand. And she, was so upset by this in her dream, and she said, who are these women? And he responded by saying, well, they're girls from my past. I had these past relationships. I have this emotional connection to them, and in a sense, they own part of me, and that can never go away. And in the dream, she wakes up, convicted, like, I have these other relationships that this could happen in. And so I used that story to start the book off, and I look back and really, it has emotional punch to it. Obviously, it's a very dramatic thing. It's a dream. It's not based in any kind of biblical teaching or anything like that. But it creates I think a great sense of fear that if you're in a relationship and if you don't get with that person, then you're going to carry that for the rest of your life, and vice versa. This other person that you're getting into a relationship has how these ghosts of girlfriends past kind of a thing. And it really became a controlling metaphor for a lot of people, and I think had instilled a lot of fear for people in the way they approached relationships.
Yes, and I can understand why. It seems like what you're saying, especially through the documentary, is if you were to have your time again, that's probably not the way you'd put it. Certainly about dating. I can imagine those.
Right.
I imagine though some Christians would think, well, actually, is this a helpful metaphor though about sex before marriage specifically? Because some Christians would argue, well, if you do sleep around before getting married, that can bring consequences into your marriage, and that can make the other person in the relationship feel uncomfortable or have questions or feel like the person they're marrying hasn't saved themselves entirely for the person they're now with. So is that still a helpful idea specifically for sex before marriage?
Well, that's a great question. And I think, in a sense, what my book was doing was taking all the teaching that was out there about the dangers of sex outside of marriage and backing that up and saying, well, if that's true and we want to avoid that, then we should also avoid everything that leads up to that consequence. Don't just get close to the line, stay as far away from the line as possible.
Yes.
And so that's where you had people who were, saying you can't get into emotional relationships, and we did an article called "Emotional Fornication." I mean, it's just it's like it's a slippery slope in terms of once you go down that path, how far do you take that? Is it just sexual intercourse? Is it kissing? Is it any kind of connection, and those types of things? So I think that the balance in all of this is that I think people should um, be honest and have their eyes open to the effects of any decision they make. There can be heartache when you are close to someone, whether that's emotionally or physically, and then you're not with them. That there can be regret there, but I think it all has to do with the framework that you're viewing. Is that something that has been lost forever? Are you damaged goods? Or do you have the mindset of saying, you know what, maybe I would do something differently, but I learned from that. I'm still a complete person, even from a Christian perspective, being able to say, I'm loved and accepted by God. This doesn't define me. These choices are not the defining qualities of who I am. I think my writing really lacked that nuance and balance. And for a lot of really impressionable young people, it created, for some at least, really kind of control us, a sense of real fear.
Mm.
And I think that had a negative impact on their view of relationships and even sexuality.
Yes. You say that to begin with, at least, the majority of the response was very positive. So bring us up to date with what happened next. And when you started to notice, actually, there were a lot of people out there who, as you say, have felt hurt by the book. When did that come in your story?
Well, I began to receive criticism, in the years following my book. I remember when a book called Boundaries in Dating came out, and actually, at the very outset, needed to address my book. My book had become influential enough that it sort of shifted the conversation, and any kind of discussion of Christian dating had to include, well, is dating even a good thing for Christians now because of my writing? And I remember reading that and being a little tentative and thinking, okay, how do I process this? But I had people around me at the time who, even as I voiced those doubts, they were just basically saying, you just need to stand your ground. You need to be a strong leader. You're too worried about people's criticism. And so I really shoved all that aside. And I tried to, in my own teaching, and when I would, when this topic would come up, qualify things. I wasn't trying to force this on people or say everybody has to do this. So I think it gave me the sense of, well, as long as I'm not being, dogmatic about this, that's fine. But what I wasn't realizing, I think, were the far-reaching effects of it, and I think the effects of ideas, especially when it comes to things like how you approach relationships, you don't just see immediately. In other words, a year after my book came out, you can't really measure, what's the long-term result of adopting this. And so, 15, 20 years go by, and people who adopted these ideas and tried to put my book into practice, they suddenly have a track record. There's now data, and whether that's positive and people saying this helped me get out of, an unhealthy lifestyle, and I married my spouse because this book, gave me good insight, or people who are now coming back and saying, hey, this didn't work. This actually damaged me. This traumatized me. Those voices began to be heard, online. There was a gentleman who did a blog in the States that was called, I Kiss Dating Goodbye, Wisdom or Foolishness. And he was critiquing different things. And so I began to hear about those things. And honestly, I didn't pay enough attention. That's one of the regrets that I have. I think it was easy for me to just write people off as, haters, basically, like, well, they're just angry and they just don't, like me, or they're just not serious about whatever. And here are all these people who do like my writing and stand by it. But essentially what took place is that I began to see problems in the church culture that I had been a part of. I began to listen to people, and I began to understand the concept that even well-intentioned choices and leadership can have negative consequences for people. And I saw that in my church. I saw that even in my own life. And that, in a sense, opened me up to evaluating my book. But I was scared to do that. I mean, it was one of those things that I kept kind of pushing away because I didn't know what would be on the other side of that if I opened up the door, that my books had flaws. What did I do with that? Did I, was it just some sort of statement? And did the book stay out there? And how can you possibly, fix something when it's been out for, almost 2 decades?
Mm.
So it was stopping being a pastor to go to a graduate school of theology in Vancouver, BC, that really gave me the space and the time, and I think the lack of outward pressure from leading a church to ask some of those questions.
Yes.
And that was really where the journey really began in earnest.
Yes. And what was the reason for stopping leading the church and going and studying more theology?
Well, I mean, the short answer is that I was just completely burnt out from ministry. We had gone through about 5 years of internal political, upheaval and tension and church splits and movement splits. And then our church was hit with a lawsuit related to reporting sexual abuse. So we were being scrutinized there, and we initiated bringing in someone to independently evaluate us. And that process really revealed that I had participated in a real mistake of failing to report something, which I hadn't even realized the gravity of that until that moment. So I was dealing with really feeling crushed by my own failures, feeling just weary in the work. And also, I think feeling, I'd been writing a lot of, kind of youthful momentum and success. And that was a low point for me of saying, you know what, I actually have had very little time to study and to learn. And all the learning that I've done has been in one church setting, one kind of approach to leadership. And so that was the moment where I thought, I really think I need to step back and get a bigger perspective through education.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like a huge amount of upheaval and difficulty, as you say, burnout with your last church. And so you go away to study, and after all that difficulty and burnout and angst, you then decide to make a documentary talking to your fiercest critics. I mean,
well, when you put it like that, it doesn't sound like a very good idea.
I mean, is there something here? I mean, you're clearly a very humble guy who's willing to listen to people own up and say, hold your hands up and say, I made a mistake. Is that the lesson we should take from this part of your life?
Well, I don't know that I want anyone to take any lessons from any of this, but yeah, I'm hesitant to repeat the mistakes of the past and try to hold my own journey up as this, example that other people should follow. I think we all have to learn and grow. And I think for me, what I think is unique about what I've gone through is that it took weakness and failure and the pain of those things to get me to a point where I was willing to listen to and consider the voices of people who were criticizing what I was doing, and willing to open myself up to the possibility of being wrong, which is a very difficult thing and involves losing, I think, a sense of confidence. I think there are a lot of emotions and feelings as people of faith that we equate with being close to God, being useful to God, which are often not necessarily the Holy Spirit working in you. They're just being successful and feeling good about yourself. And so when you lose some of those things through different circumstances, it can be a very, I think, fruitful and beneficial moment to be more honest and be more reflective. And I think that's what it was for me.
You're listening to Premier Christian Radio. I'm Sam Hales, interviewing Joshua Harris about his best-selling book, I Kissed Dating Goodbye, and why he's now apologising for it and has withdrawn it from sale. Really fascinating conversation. Hope you're enjoying it. Join us for much more from Joshua Harris right after this.
In a world where fake news is taken at face value and fiction has become fact, How do we share true faith in Jesus? Unbelievable the Conference 2019 will equip a new generation to speak truth in a post-truth world. Join me, Justin Briley, and a team of world-class speakers ready to give reasons for Christian hope in today's skeptical world. Unbelievable the Conference 2019, Saturday the 20th of July in London. Brought to you in partnership with ADF International and Biola Apologetics. Book your early bird tickets at premierchristianradio.com/speaking truth.
Christianity Magazine. In this month's issue,
I've only ever been told two things about sin, says Nick Page. It's bad and don't do it. In the latest issue, he shares 7 helpful tips on how to stop sinning. Liz Carter explains how she's learnt the secret of contentment, despite many years spent suffering in hospital. Pete Gregg, the founder of the 24/7 prayer movement, teaches us to pray, and Joshua Harris tells us why he's pulping his best-selling Christian book. Plus, we talk to the Christians who are deconstructing their most cherished beliefs as we ask the question, can faith survive doubt?
for your free copy, visit premierchristianity.com/free sample.
The Profile. You're listening to Premier Christian Radio.
Welcome back to The Profile here on Premier Christian Radio with me, Sam Hales. My guest today is Joshua Harris, the author of the best-selling Christian book, I Kissed Dating Goodbye. Years on from releasing that book, Joshua Harris has now apologised for it, removed it from sale, and also created a documentary called I Survived, I Kissed Dating Goodbye, where he interviews some of his fiercest critics about why the book was so destructive for many people who read it. If you want to watch that documentary, it is freely available online. Just search for I Survived, I Kissed Dating Goodbye, and you'll be able to watch it free online. I recommend viewing it. But now, without any further ado, let's listen in to the rest of my conversation with Joshua Harris about the book and the documentary. Now, obviously, every author, to a certain extent, gets criticism. I wonder for you, was it the quality of the criticism, or was it the quantity of it that was the final decision for you to say, right, I'm going to do this documentary, I'm going to really go around and talk to people, see what effect this had? Is there a particular moment where you sort of really resolved that, no, I really do need to do this? Because as I say, lots of other authors will have criticism and not feel the need to respond in the way you have.
Right. Well, the way that it unfolded, there wasn't a perfect master plan. It wasn't this immediate, hey, let's make a documentary. It was really a process of recognizing I think there are flaws in my book, but I'm not sure exactly what they are. Beginning to hear, I think, consistency of critique and story related to unhelpful aspects of my book. I think that would be the most important thing. And then I think recognizing that it was coming from a broad group of people and not just from people who, for example, people who have moved on from the Christian faith. It's easy to, I don't think it's fair to write them off, but it's easy for people to write them off because you can just say, well, you're not even a Christian. You don't, believe the Bible anymore. So why should I listen to what you have to say about, this Christian book, for example? Mm-hmm. But then when I started to hear from people who were still Christians, who didn't have any animosity for me in general, but were saying, honestly, this, was unhelpful in these ways. And then I think having real interaction with people that wasn't just online, but was in person. So it was the diversity and then the consistency. And so, I was kind of contemplating, how should I handle this, and trying to think about that and being uncertain. And it ended up being a interaction on Twitter where a woman tweeted, to me that your book was used against me like a weapon. And I just responded to her in a person-to-person moment. I said, I'm so sorry. And I want to be evaluating this. And that tweet ended up getting picked up by different, media outlets, and articles started to be written. And in a sense, in a good way, it forced my hand to say, okay, well, are you really going to do this? You're saying you want to do this. You've been thinking about this for a long time. And I did not know how in the world to do it. I I didn't want to do it in a rushed way. I knew that just emotionally and psychologically it was going to be a difficult process. And so I took the step of saying, well, I want to invite people to share their stories. And I did a few interviews to get the word out about that. And I got over 600 letters from people. And reading through those letters, I began to see a lot of the things that I had said to kind of diffuse the issue or divert it. I would say, well, it's people have only been hurt when the book was forced on them. That was kind of in my mind. If
Right.
someone made them read it or, it became a rule, then that was unhelpful.
Yeah.
And I began to get letters that showed that, but also letters where people picked it up themselves. Nobody made them, do it. They just tried to adopt it themselves out of their own sense of this being right. And then they were sharing, and this was unhelpful to me. And it made me think in, unhealthy ways.
Yes.
And so that had a big impact. And it was during all of that taking place that I was interacting with a fellow student who wanted to make a documentary. And I kind of thought, you know what? This needs to be public. I can't just do this in secret. And number two, a documentary could be viewed by people who might never take the time to read something I write. I'm not really wanting to write another book, to try to fix all these things. I think it would make sense to do a documentary. And the documentary became in itself the journey of, interacting with people, face to face, and became really helpful for me personally.
I think it's a very clever way of doing it, because any teaching that comes across in the documentary, it comes from others, doesn't it? It comes from the people you're interviewing. So it's almost as if other voices are allowed to speak into your work, which I imagine for some people who have been very hurt by the book, rightly or wrongly, may feel like, well, I don't really want to hear too much more from Joshua because I feel really hurt. And I thought it was quite a clever way of doing the documentary, actually, to allow other voices to correct, rather than you, as you say, writing a whole book or going into teaching again.
Well, I'm glad you said that. I would agree. I love the fact that it was for most of the documentary, it's about me learning from other people. I love the fact that the documentary was produced by a woman, and someone who had, herself been negatively affected by my book. And I also like that it was showing an honest progression for me. I mean, we've crowdfunded it and did a Kickstarter, and one of the challenges was that people were saying, well, what's your conclusion going to be before I support you in your project? And we had to say to them, we honestly don't know. That's what the whole idea of this film is Josh is on this journey. We're capturing that, and we don't know where he's going to land. And that was what we tried to capture.
So for those who aren't aware, what would you say are the main criticisms that came through that you felt you really needed to listen to? I mean, were there any common things that you were just hearing again and again about, well, the book was unhelpful in this way, or the book emphasized this point that I now think is wrong?
Yeah, I think that it was things like instilling a sense of fear, being more preoccupied with, making mistakes in relationships. I think it was an unhealthy view of romance and sexuality, that it's more like this, in particular, the human heart is this limited resource. And if you give some of it away, it's this idea of being damaged or having lost something. It's not about growing and learning from that experience. I think in instilling fear, it gave people, it caused them to draw back from, moving towards other people. And, for some people, I think, like I'm a very outgoing person. It's easy for me to interact with women. But for a person who is more shy, for example, a book like mine could actually encourage hesitancy and a being closed off in a way that is unhealthy, where they don't learn how to interact. Another, I think, big problem in it is that as it emphasized the importance of waiting for commitment, one of the negative consequences is that people made a potential relationship so serious so soon. And so if they've waited for commitment and then they're interacting with this person, they're, instead of just saying, I want to take the time to get to know you, and I want to get to know a lot of different people, and I want to make a really informed decision about who I marry, there was a sense of this needs to be serious from the get-go. I won't even start unless I know it can be serious. And then once it started, there can be a sense of pressure of, well, then we need to really make this work and have it lead towards marriage, which is obviously not always a wise thing. And so, I had the mindset of, if the courtship doesn't work out, then that's successful because you learned that it wasn't the right person. But in actuality, for a lot of people, it created this environment where there's a sense of, well, if it doesn't work out, then, again, you've given part of your heart away, and that's really negative. And so people, I think, oftentimes felt a sense of pressure and having made an ill-advised decision.
Sure. And I know in the documentary, it kind of comes across, I think, when you talk to various people that you're really taking on board a lot of these criticisms. But I guess as well, you must have heard criticisms both then and now that you think, well, actually, no, I would still agree with that part of my book. And really the conclusion of the documentary, while you explained that, you really want to apologise for how it's hurt people, it's not as simple as just saying all of this book was wrong and I regret it all, is it? I mean, there must be elements of the book that actually you would still stand by.
Yeah, there are definitely elements that I would still stand by, and I think there are elements that where I see people actually genuinely being helped by the concepts in the book. I think there is a lot of there's a lot of unhealthy things about dating in general, and Christians see this, and even secular people see this about how if you're going from one relationship to another and not really caring about the long-term good of the other person, you can really use people and begin to view them, objectify people, just use them for kind of the emotional high or the sexual experience. And I think that can be damaging to other people. And I think we lose some of our humanity when we don't care about and really love other people genuinely. So I think there are some good things to consider. I think that some people feel like they always have to be in a dating relationship or with someone to be complete. And I've talked to a lot of people who, they said this book gave me the courage to have a season where I wasn't dating. And I hear that from a lot of people, even people who don't subscribe to, the ideas in I Kiss Dating Goodbye, that sometimes it's not a bad idea to take a break from dating, and just get healthy yourself, get really grounded in who you are. If you have a faith and a relationship with God, to really work on that. And so I think there are some healthy aspects of the book that, but on balance, I came to the conclusion that the negative had outweighed what was positive, and that's why I reached the conclusion I did.
I wonder how much of the book came from a particular kind of culture that you were in. I'd love to dig a bit more into that. I mean, I use the example of when I myself was a teenager at a big Christian event in the UK, and this couple were on stage talking about sex and relationships, and they're now married, and they said, we chose not to kiss at all during the time we were dating or the time we were engaged. And I think a lot of young people in the tent, myself included, thought, wow, that's so impressive. How have they managed that? And then, of course, it emerged that they dated for about 2 or 3 months, got engaged for about 2 or 3 months, and then were married. And I was sitting there having dated my girlfriend for about, 2 or 3 years, thinking, well, this is just a different culture. And I'm aware as well, you mentioned homeschooling a couple of times, which,
right.
and I've travelled to parts of, I guess, the Bible Belt in America where there is a culture actually of, in my experience, being very deliberate and intentional about who you're with and getting married very quickly. So how much of that kind of culture were you a part of, and how much of that culture, I guess, influenced some of the thinking in the book?
Well, nobody writes in a vacuum. Everybody has influences, ideas that have come before them that shaped the generation before them, and they either embrace that or react to that. And part of my process of reevaluation was looking at that very closely. I didn't just show up as a 20-year-old and have all these brand new ideas and revelations. I had been shaped by what was taking place in the culture, what was taking place in the church. And so I did a guided study with a professor as part of this reevaluation, where I went back and read a lot of books and was evaluating from a theological and a sociological perspective, and then looking at the fallout from that. And that's not to pass blame on anyone else. It was more just to say, why did I think the things that I did? What shaped that? What was that informed by? Was that helpful? How have things changed since then? What have we learned from that? And I think that process is a really important one for anybody who's, in the realm of ideas and influence, but especially for people in the church. I think we don't pause and consider like that as much as we should, and we don't learn from the lessons of church history as we should. Going to graduate school and taking different church history classes was really helpful for me to see the the way in which movements and ideas and concepts would play themselves out, and the church is always making mistakes and then growing from that. But we can't really grow from our victories or our failures if we're not willing to look at them and be honest about what was helpful or unhelpful, and critique that in light of the Bible's teaching and so on. So that was something that I learned, and I hope one of the effects that I hope this documentary has is that it will encourage conversations, and it will encourage people in the church to be willing to engage with people who are hurting, and be willing to learn from mistakes. A lot of our movements in the evangelical world are driven by fads. They're driven by book sales. They're driven by conferences. They're driven by, different things that then kind of roll through, and then nobody stops to say, let's evaluate whether that was good or bad. It's just on to the next thing. And I think that part of the danger in not being rooted in solid tradition and in church history is that you're very susceptible to whatever the latest religious fad is, and you can run along with that or even lead, something like that, and then not really deal with what the actual outcome is.
You mentioned a few times this idea of the book almost instilling a fear in people, and the other word that's used quite a lot in the documentary is grace. I'd love to know, again, for your own background, was there a lot of emphasis on the grace of God and on forgiveness? Because some people have said, well, the book comes across at times as a little bit legalistic. And again, you say no one writes in a vacuum. I'd be interested to know if you think that's a fair criticism, then maybe where that came from. And again, not asking you to pass the blame or pass the buck to whoever was teaching you, but it made me curious. Were you part of a church that was heavily emphasizing grace, or not so much?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think in my writing of the book, I don't know that I would have been in an environment that heavily emphasized grace. Although I talked a lot about, I had a whole chapter that is probably one of the highlights of the book that talks about, Jesus covering all of our mistakes, and that, his grace is what really makes it possible for us to move forward and so on.
Wow. Were people just not reading that bit then? Because it seems like so much of the criticism has been, it's legalistic, but you saying you had a whole chapter on grace.
Well, it's an interesting thing with grace because, in the way, in the way that the human heart works, and the way that a sermon can work or a book can work, you can have the right qualifying statements. You can have, statements about grace, chapter on forgiveness, those types of things. But things like illustrations and stories and an emphasis on the practical of what you have to do can really end up sabotaging that emphasis on grace in ways that you don't even realize. Yeah. So I can take you to points in the book that are saying, you don't have to, this is not a rule, or don't treat this like a formula, or, talking about God's grace and all those types of things. But the overall impact of a book or a sermon or whatever it might be is going to be affected by the weighting. It's not just that it's present, but how much weight is given to it, how much time is given to it. And I think grace is one of those things that you have to, emphasize so strongly that it almost shocks people and almost sounds scandalous to really believe in how all-encompassing and transforming it is. And so I think I was a part of churches that would pride themselves in talking about the gospel and pride themselves in talking about grace, but they had deeply rooted cultural practices that ended up I think undermining that and ended up creating an environment where you were very aware of how you were doing, your performance as a parent, your performance as, in relationships, your performance in, your quiet times and all those types of things, which again, I mean, this is the tension that you see in Scripture. This is why this tension never goes away in church history, and why you have different camps of people who, are kind of chanting grace and, and effort fueled sanctification at each other back and forth, right?
Yes, of course.
So it's easy to swing back and forth,
Sure.
and I think writing something that's balanced is very difficult.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you, I guess, going over both the book and the film with us today. I know that a few months ago, I think we were talking about doing this conversation, and I had an email back saying that at that point you wanted to let this documentary speak for itself and you wouldn't actually be giving any more interviews. So I really appreciate, looks like you've changed your mind on that. Why did you change your mind on that?
Well, there were different circumstances that led to that change. I really did want to stop talking about it, and I didn't want to keep presenting myself as this expert that was out there. I felt like the documentary and the interviews that I'd already done spoke for themselves. But there was an issue where the distribution company was going to be charging for the film for 3 months before they made it free. And I had always wanted the film to be free from the beginning and free from the get-go. And so the way in which I helped convince everybody to sign on to giving the film away for free was the agreement for me to do media. So that's why I'm kind of back out here doing conversations like this and trying to draw.
Yeah. It can't be easy.
Yeah.
It can't be easy because I'm aware, having seen the film and now having this conversation with you, I'm aware I am, going over stuff which you, like you say, you've already had to almost emotionally process in the process of just, making the film. Did you find that whole, tell me more about the kind of what was going through your head when you were having these very lengthy conversations with your critics? It can't have always been easy, or an enjoyable experience.
Well, it was hard for me because it's one thing to kind of contemplate or just in a general way say, well, I got some things wrong. But when you're sitting across from someone and they're sharing their story and they're sharing the pain that they've experienced, and because of the ideas that you wrote about, there's a lot of sadness and there's a lot of regret that comes along with that. So it was harder for me than I think I anticipated. Also, I think, my own sense of worth and identity had, even though I would not have wanted to admit this, was wrapped up in the success of my book. It was my ability to say I was a best-selling author, and here's this book that I'm known for. And so to critique it and ultimately to, bury it and discontinue the publishing of it, it felt like a part of me was dying. And I'm not trying to be overly dramatic. I mean, I really tried to keep the focus on other people's experience and pain that they had been through. But I also, had to try to kind of listen to what was going on internally. And I definitely had to walk through some valleys there in that process. So
after all of this, what's next and what are you doing now? Are you still involved in ministry?
I'm no longer involved in ministry. I made the decision not to go back into pastoral ministry as I was at grad school. And I think that the Graduate School of Theology that I was at, Regent College, does a really good job of teaching about, all of life as ministry, and that we all have a calling, that we're all serving God, whether we're a plumber or a pastor. And I think it was a space for me to be honest about what I actually wanted. And I realized that I didn't want to continue to pastor. So I'm using my love for communication, my love for storytelling to help businesses and nonprofits and charities communicate their message. So I do branding strategy and marketing strategy, and I'm writing and speaking on these things and really helping other people find their voice to be able to communicate.
So would it be fair to say that in 3 months' time, or however long you've got left of this agreement of talking to Christian journalists about this film, is it fair to say that when all those interviews are done, you're really kind of looking forward to that point and it all just being done?
I'm looking forward to it being done, and yes, that will be a good moment.
Well, Josh, I've really appreciated talking to you, and really the journey you've been on, I think, is really quite incredible. I mean, correct if I'm wrong, but I'm not aware of any other Christian authors who've really done anything like this. It's quite an unusual thing to do, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm sure there have been others. I was inspired actually when I was at school, and read about how Augustine had done towards the end of his life, basically a reflection on all of his writings, and basically retractions, I think was the title in English. And I thought, it wouldn't be bad for everybody to consider that kind of exercise.
So given the choice, if we were to rewind time back to when you were in your early 20s, knowing what you know now, would you either write a different book or not write a book at all?
Oh boy, I feel so gun shy right now when it comes to this. I think I probably would lean towards not writing at all, but that's a scary question.
I'm surprised. I would have thought you'd say, well, having gone on this journey, I feel more enlightened, better equipped to understand some of these topics, and would be able to write a book filled with a bit more wisdom on the subject.
Yeah, I think that kind of theoretical question, to be able to know all that I know now, and to go back to that moment and write that kind of book. What I think is so fascinating about it is I in a sense, I think the outcome would be similar to not having written at all, because I think a book like that wouldn't have sold, and I wouldn't be having this problem either way. I mean, and I say that I laugh at it, but I think it's also true. I think the reason that I'm here talking about this is because the book sold. If it had sold 5 copies,
absolutely.
it wouldn't be an issue. And I think if I had written the kind of thoughtful, nuanced, overall more helpful book, I don't think it would have become this kind of cultural phenomenon that I Kiss Dating Goodbye became.
Or maybe there's a slight lesson there. If anyone is really eager to write a best-selling book, be careful. You might get what you wish for.
That's well said.
Well, Josh, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Yeah, great to be with you. Thank you for the conversation.
That was Joshua Harris in conversation with me, Sam Hales, about his book, I Kiss Dating Goodbye, and really the criticism that has followed it and the reasons for him now making this documentary, I Survived, I Kiss Dating Goodbye. It's a really fascinating watch. I do encourage you to check it out. It is freely available online. We've also written up that interview in the latest edition of Premier Christianity magazine, so you can read the interview and find out more there. You can get a free sample copy at premierchristianity.com/free sample. Simply put your details in and we'd be delighted to send you a completely free copy of the latest issue. It's a great one to get hold of. And if you're listening this afternoon here on Premier Christian Radio, did you know that this show is now available as a podcast? That means you can access past shows and you will get a brand new episode of The Profile every week, direct to wherever you get your podcast from, on your mobile phone, your tablet. If you want to access it, you can download it completely free. Just go to premierchristianradio.com/The Profile, or search for The Profile wherever you normally get your podcasts from. Well over 100 interviews now with leading Christians from all walks of life on The Profile podcast. Coming up next here on Premier Christian Radio is Premier Playback. Have a great rest of your weekend.